So during the video comments, each of you talked about things that we need to do in this state, whether it's around education, housing, reskilling employees. As you think about those important things that we need to do, are they happening in other states right now? And would you say that we are ahead or behind when it comes to doing these important things in our state, again, whether it's around education, housing, reskilling, et cetera?
I wanted to think about that a little bit because I think what's happening in education in terms of a redesign.
Jim, can you get the microphone a little closer to your?
Close? Okay, this better?
Yeah.
I think what's happening around the country in trying to rethink about education from a learner-centered perspective rather than an instruction-driven perspective, that it's popping up in a lot of places. There are not a lot of statewide initiatives. It's more a ground-up clustering that I think is starting to form into a movement. So I would say there are maybe half a dozen states around the country where there's some serious work going on. There are another 15 states maybe where there are examples, and there are some states where there's really not anything going on at all.
Well, thank you. I've been concerned all day long because we keep talking about the house burning down. You know, our people sell houses, so and we're short on supply.
But you picked a color for the kitchen, didn't you?
As it is, yeah. So there are places across the country that are doing more in the area of affordable housing, and I actually think that affordable housing is one of those differentiators that we have in Wisconsin right now. We're losing it as we speak, but it's something that I think with the right attention and investment, that could be one of those differentiating moments for us here. Other states have tried things. Governor Evers put into his state budget in the early part of the year a program that would provide first-time home buyers with a savings account, like you do in EdVest, where you can put money away at a tax-free or lower tax consequence to be able to be put in for a down payment on a house if you're a first-time home buyer. That was a great idea. It's been tried in other states. It's worked in other states. There's separate legislation on that right now, but the legislature decided not to include it in the state budget. But those types of incentives, we talked about, Darren talked about some of the ones that we saw across the north and the east coast. So you do have public policies that are going towards incentivizing either the construction of housing or the ownership of housing that I think Wisconsin needs to catch up on. And like I said in my video, the good news is that at all levels of government, even the federal government, we're talking about having a housing focus, a housing crisis, and that we need to do something at all three levels of government.
I think across the country, there are states that are doing things differently. And I think if you listen to this whole day, you've heard reasons why. I know Tim talked about a differentiated taxation system that we have, where we're more property tax and sales tax. So there's a different revenue streams that we have. Jim brought up the question earlier, kind of the what are we trying to get accomplished in the overall picture. When you think about it, back in the 50s and 60s, as the generations kept coming up, the goal was to always have the next generation better than us. Our next generation's going to get better than us. We got to the baby boomers, and the baby boomers says, we're pretty dang good. We're going to have the best generation there ever is. Oh, we got to do something about our kids. And I'm right in the tail end. I'm a 64 board kid. So I'm right at the end of the baby boomers or the X's. Depends on which one I really want to feel like I'm doing right now. But I think that's part of our challenge. We took off. And when you look at our history, we took off in the late 60s, 70s, and the 80s, everything exploded. And we didn't think much about what's to the next generation. And so I think Wisconsin right now, we've got a lot of really good things that are working and are starting to work well. The challenge is we've got a lot of little things that we've got to clean up. And I think that's going to be part of the issue as I looked at this conversation we're having today, you can hear there's some pockets of things that are working, pockets of ideas that are effective, but we still don't have the overbridled urgency to say we've got to make a difference. We've got to change what we do. When I was sitting in the back of the room listening to today, I was thinking to myself, when I had my small business, when the economy took a hit in 2008 as a home inspector, thank you very much, you guys gave me a lot of business, my business dropped in half within 8 months. People weren't buying homes. So I had to retool and figure out what I had to do and started another company. We're at the level of government where we keep saying, you know what we're going to do? We're going to keep piling on and keep piling on and keep piling on. But we never look back at government and say, what don't we need to do anymore? What can we get out of the way? What can we streamline? What can we drop out of government that the private sector can take care of more competitively now and more efficiently for us so that we can focus on what we need to do? And I think that's part of the challenge that we have to face in government is as we're looking at housing in the neighborhood initiative, we've been working in Waukesha County. Average home right now to build a house in Waukesha County is $500,000. Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but I can't even afford that right now. And that's the challenge we have is trying to create new homes and new opportunities. We're already hit the hurdle way too high. So even when we look at education and trying to figure out how we're going to do early childhood education, we don't have the capacity because we've never changed the model of how we supply the funds to it or how we evaluate what's happening in the schools. And I think what we need right now is a major overhaul in what we do.
I'm going to toss, I want to come back to that point in a second, and I want to reframe my question a little bit for you, Kaleem, because you did talk about some of what's happening in the other states when it comes to early childhood education, but you also spoke about some of the incredible results you're producing at one city. I mean, does Wisconsin have an opportunity to differentiate itself, do you think, in the early childhood education arena, and if so, how might we go about doing a better job of differentiating ourselves there?
Yeah, I do, and I'll be a little bit more specific than I was last time. One thing is understanding what the message could be that people can really rally around. I'm trying to challenge employers when they think about their workforce, start to think about them as families, because stable businesses are ultimately defined by and in part by stable families. The more stable your families are, the more successful your business sector is going to be. Having a lot of youth, too, in a business sector is okay, but if that defines your workforce, that's a very transient workforce often. They move a lot, they move around a lot, they want a career build quickly. Stability can be challenged, so providing a place where families can succeed is really important, and then that's where I feel like Wisconsin could win. But we got to connect those strategies to other challenges and other ways we're trying to tackle those challenges. One has been, someone mentioned housing. The challenge with housing is that when you have population growth, so think about if we've made preschool education, early childhood education free in Wisconsin, it would attract a lot of people here. People would choose to stay where they felt there were quality schools, but the more people, the cost of housing and other services tend to go up, not down. And so Wisconsin has to figure out how does it allow for population growth while also ensuring that the cost of living, you think of San Francisco, places like that have grown tremendously, and most of us can't live there. So just real quick, I wanted to say that I do think Wisconsin could do it, but here's how. I'll give you a model that we're going to follow. I feel like, again, we got to look at the models that we already have that are succeeding. We've got to evaluate those models, not only look at the quality that they're producing in terms of young people, but how are they financed? What goes into making a quality school, and where could those funds come from also to support that effort? And then I think, we're going to do, like, I'm looking to hire right now 8 to 9 people to go to be in different places around Wisconsin where they are going to educate people in those local communities about the importance of early childhood education while also getting feedback about what it would take for us to do it there from the mindset of the people around the state. Then what we want to do is codify that into a really concrete message, but also some strategies we can use to start to actually push out information out there using television, using radio, using social media to really dominate the market. So it's running like a campaign. And I've done this before. That's how we got all this change in Washington, D.C. We did something very similar using support from a variety of people across the country. We used the ground game. We ran it like a campaign. We used the air war after that. We saturated the market with information and talked to people on the ground multiple times. And ultimately what we ended up with in 18 months was significant policy change, and D.C. hasn't looked back since. And so I feel like we could do something here, but we have to look at what those models are. What does the data and evidence tell us, both financially but also qualitatively, and then start to really move information out there into communities across the state to generate that groundswell of support.
Back to Tim's earlier point about payment and stuff. A critical piece of the go forward, I think, is that what has worked for us since World War II is a set of equations that we built between cost, payment, and value. Okay? We're now having trouble with how those get sorted out. Okay? Education, for example, nobody argues that education adds value, but it's difficult because you want your money up front, okay, before that's come in. So it's not that the value is not there, but when the value is realized financially is different than when you pay for it. Housing faces a similar kind of issue. There's no question, and we don't do full enough balance sheet, in my opinion. Housing does stable neighborhoods produce lower costs in education, lower costs in welfare issues, and public safety and everything else. Part of the go forward is saying, how do you go about recognizing the fuller value of employment, of work, of family, of home ownership, of all of those items, and then asking yourself whether we could amortize that differently so that we can, because it will not help us to distort the market by refusing to recognize cost. The federal government now pays, 23 cents or 33 cents on every Medicaid dollar that's charged, or whatever, somewhere in that neighborhood. They've just discounted it. That didn't make the cost go away per se. It just figured out in terms of how they were going to pay it at that moment in time. That's not sustainable. And so there's some very interesting questions here, I think, that sit on the table. You have time for one more question, then I want to open it up to the table. And just as an announcement, we've had a conversation, I think, if it's okay with the audience, rather than breaking everybody up, what I'd like to do is take a panel with Tim Sullivan and Mike Theo and Tim Hanna and myself and Jim Buheim and do a plenary session on those three elements. So legislative vision, employer vision. Does that make sense, or would you prefer to break into groups, separate groups? How many people think it makes sense? Show of hands. How many people would rather break into smaller groups? Okay, we're going to go down that road, and we'll make other adjustments. So, Jim, back to you.
Well, so I want to come back to something, Paul, that you said, and that's we've also got to figure out how to get out of the way of ourselves in some areas. Toss it to you first, but then I'll open it up to the full table of, are there other examples there of things that we might need to get out of the way of, or make some changes of from a public sector perspective to tangibly improve these areas of education, housing, reskilling, and more?
Yeah, I think there's some great opportunities. I think when you look at education, we're seeing some changes now that we haven't seen before. And I'll use the example. I use it all the time, and Cindy knows where I'm kind of going with this, is HERA. Higher Education Regional Alliance here in southeastern Wisconsin was created about 2.5 years ago, right after the Foxconn announcement was made, because the colleges said, you know what, we've got to figure out how we're going to prepare our workforce quicker. How are we going to get through with the degrees that we need? How are we going to be able to engage people more effectively? Well, they realized the best way to do it is they're going to compete against each other and collaborate at the exact same time. And that's when you start seeing a change in how we look at things. You look at WCTC, starting in June of next year, is going to an 8-week semester program. And I don't know if it's going to be quarters now or what they're going to call it. But instead of 16 weeks, they're breaking it down to 8, because that's the chunk of time people can utilize while they're still working. And they can stack their way to their degrees and work on the certificates. Those are the ideas. When we have government saying it takes you 8 to 10 months before we can figure out how a permit is properly set, then businesses have to suffer because we have to wait till they can get going. If we can figure out how to streamline the process so there's less touches in it as it moves forward, that's going to be our big key. And I think that's the challenge that we have. In fact, I was sitting here. I have ADD. I apologize. Tom Moe was the county administrator in Ozaukee County. And if anybody in the room knows Tom Moe, Tom had this heat map that showed what overlays of government we had in Wisconsin. And the darker the blue, the more levels of governance we had. Unfortunately, most of the state is this nice, deep, dark blue. And you start looking at what do we have to do to break through that to get things done more efficiently. 37 municipalities in Waukesha County, our goal is that when a permit comes in, the county accepts the municipality's information and allows it to kind of move forward so that we're not reinventing the wheel, as it was said earlier. Those are the things that we can look at doing, and I think we've got to continue to look at that from the state level as well, even the federal government, on where has the overreach occurred and how can we peel it back down to the closest level of governance, which makes it most efficient.
Well, I couldn't agree more with what you just said. The cost of, the cost of producing housing is bad enough. We talked about minimum lot sizes, and you mentioned Foxconn. I think there's municipalities around the Foxconn development that have 3-acre minimum lot sizes for a house. I mean, we need to be putting 300 units that close to that kind of a manufacturing facility. And the cost just skyrockets from there. Colleen brought up the point. When you restrict the land available for buildable lots, the price goes up exponentially. And I think the national home builders have numbers about the percentage of a new construction that's attributable to government regulations or delays in permitting, et cetera. That's on the new home side. I'll throw another one that brings the education and the housing together that we could look at too, and it's the way we fund our schools. It's the way we fund local units of government. Wisconsin, if you take a graph about how we fund local government in the state of Wisconsin, triple any other state is our over-reliance on the property tax. And that's an antiquated system that was created back in a time when that made a little bit more sense, but it hasn't been updated forever. And we have limits on property taxes here because property taxes was too darn high on homeowners for too many years. We have to rethink how we do that. Because what happens when you do that? You pit a family that wants to live in a home in the area that they want to live in against the school district. And when I say housing is a differentiator for the future on how to retain and attract new workers, it's quality of life that goes around that home ownership that's equally important. And those are usually funded by property taxes in today's system. So garbage, snow removal, police and fire protection, all municipal services, transportation, schools, everything that goes into the quality of life that a homeowner enjoys and when they make a selection of a place to live is dependent on the taxes that they have to pay for those services. I think to the degree that Wisconsin diversifies the way local units of government pay for those services and get it off the property taxes, the more you're going to have a unanimity between local units of government and the property owner moving in the same direction.
I was also going to say, if I was governor, I would propose to flatten the educational system from 4 systems to 3. We are double funding and triple funding education, and here's how. There's very little money going into preschool education if you're not poor. The federal government passes money through to families who are working, going to school, getting some job training assistance so they can provide education for their children early so they can go to work. But very few families gain access to that. Everyone else is on the free market. And we know that birth to 5 is the most critical time in a child's life, but it really is dependent upon your parents' ability to pay. So disadvantage and advantage is already hardwired into the system, but we really don't fund that publicly in Wisconsin. K through 12, we have that. Then we have tech schools / career education, and then we have higher education. I would propose to eliminate tech colleges and career education and bring it back to what it originally was. Tech colleges grew out of around World War II, grew out of high school. There was a need for more automation. There was a great expansion of industry. And so we created these alternative forms of educating large masses of people. But we don't need a system like that, my argument is, again. And when you look at what high schools are doing, they're trying to provide now more of what technical schools are providing and partnering with them and creating early college high school programs. But yet they're hiring 2 people to teach math. These people are hiring the same people to teach math. The tech colleges nationally have a 15% graduation rate in technical programs, 40 to 50% in their college transfer programs. That is a very low productive system. High schools have graduation rates somewhere between 50 to 80% or whatever. But it's like we're providing kids an education. They graduate from college. They go to college again. They take physics all over again. They take algebra all over again. They take calculus all over again. They do the exact same thing in their first 2 years of schooling, and it does not make sense in American education when we're trying to figure out how to cover the cost of this. So if we took all the funds that we are spending on these technical college systems in Wisconsin, and we figured out a way to provide a secondary education to young people, we're making the high schools work with our technical college systems, we would free up a lot of cash to actually invest in children birth to 5. So that's what I would propose. And I feel like we're at this point, somebody used the term rethinking. We have to rethink a lot of things in America, but we are so divided right now that we focus 90% of our time on divided thinking and strategy and none on common sense thinking about the challenges we have in front of us. And so, again, I think Wisconsin with our lightened Wisconsin idea, could move forward a great idea and figure out how, very quickly, to start a conversation, a real one, about how we eliminate all this redundancy and spending in education so we could spend it where it matters most.
Thank you. Jim?
Let me just build on what Galeem just said, because I think he's right. There's a lot of redundancy that could be wrung out of the system. I'd take it one more step, and that is that I think it's time for us to begin to de-link time and learning. If you think about the traditional school semester, that's really how long it takes to teach, not how long it takes to learn. And so what happens is we sort of estimate how long it will take to teach a given set of content, and that's what we do, knowing full well that within every class are some students who can learn it at a much faster rate, others need more time. Instead of thinking about what the learner needs, we think about coverage and presentation. It creates inefficiency in the system that is incalculable. Because some students become bored and disengaged because what they're getting is redundant or not relevant or something they've already learned, while the student across who's sitting next to them may need a lot more background before they're even able to take advantage. And so it's built into the system. We don't even think about it. But if we're starting to de-link things, if we really just started to ask the question, what's really important for young people to learn? And then starting with the learner, figure out how that path might work. The good news is we have the capacity to do that. We have examples of it. The problem we have is that we're all so stuck in the industrial model of education that it's hard for us to think about it differently.